Welcome to the Sacred Window podcast. I'm your host, Christine Devlin Eck. Here at the Center for Sacred Window Studies, we explore and expand on conscious postpartum care. We navigate the overlap of caring for others and caring for ourselves. We honor the transitions, not only in giving birth, but in being alive. Welcome to the conversation.
And I will never be the same again.
Hello, welcome to the Sacred Window podcast. I'm Christine Eck. I'm so happy to welcome back Jennifer Summerfeldt to our space. Jennifer and I spoke recently and quickly realized that our conversation had more places to go. I'm going to introduce her again just because I want everyone to know you and your work, Jennifer. Jennifer is the founder of Ask Therapy, and she's an author of a book called Healing After Birth. She's a mom, she's a therapist, a writer, and a mentor. Her organization is a virtual counseling clinic, which is dedicated to providing trauma, polyvagal, and childbirth-informed support to mothers navigating the entire perinatal continuum. So today we're kind of furthering the conversation that we began last time, which talked about the therapy map, which is a unique approach to sort of mapping out the individual person's journey of healing. We connected on the whole approach to healing, which is body, heart, mind, spirit, senses. And we just sort of began to dive into the neurological needs of someone in the postpartum window. But some things that stuck out to me in our last conversation that I wanted to pursue further was this idea of birth as an initiation, postpartum as an initiatory experience in life. And we have a few of these in our lifetime. And sort of the practical Western mindset that we are all navigating in culture doesn't want to stop and pause during initiations like that to look at what is unseen, what's happening that's under the surface. And this is where I feel that so many of the imbalances in mental health are happening when we're glossing over these initiatory experiences and not harnessing the value in them. And our process and how we're growing, there's so much mystery there. So yeah, let's just dive in. What made you say that, I guess, in our last conversation about birth as an initiatory experience?
Well, I wish I could remember the specifics of, what inspired that part of our conversation, but I can guess just based on what my frame of reference is and how I orient towards that entire spectrum, that whole childbirth continuum. And something that keeps popping up for me around, this idea of initiation and the postpartum struggle. And, there's things I'd like to talk about in terms of what could be contributing to that postpartum struggle, all the way from, sleep deprivation to a diagnosed mood disorder. Like, let's look at that whole spectrum. But the one thing that really lands for me, and I can't take full credit for this because my colleague and I have had a lot of conversation about it, and she's really lifted this up in my awareness, is this idea that culture is supposed to take care of us. And so in an intact culture, in a culture that is orienting around connection, around attachment, so an attachment-based culture, which really would be a more indigenous worldview or framework of a culture. So in a culture in which, the Western paradigm has not impacted it, which is very almost I was going to say unseen. That's not the right word, but it's almost zero at this point of, the stage of the game. But in those cultures, the culture is to take care of us and our needs so we can rest in knowing that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. And we can rest in the dependent mode of being cared for. And because that has been separated and severed from our understanding of how we think, feel, and behave within the more dominant Western culture, right? There's something happening below conscious awareness in which our system knows that it is deeply imbalanced. So that idea of culture taking care of us, in particular, after an initiatory experience, whether that was through ritual or rites of passage, and, we're prepared for that, and then we're met on that other side in ceremony and celebration. So motherhood being one of those journeys, one of those initiatory journeys in which we're preparing for this massive life event that very much is biological in nature, right? So on one hand, it's just this thing that we do. It's, part of being human is that we procreate and we give birth to offspring, right? So animal species do this. So we could say on one hand, it's not extra special. It's something that happens. But on the other hand, for each individual's journey from, let's say that maiden to motherhood, that is an initiatory experience because the act of childbirth itself is one that induces an altered state of consciousness. And we can talk more about how important that is to be able to enter those states. So in a healthy, intact culture, on that other side, we would be nourished, we would be celebrated, there would be ceremony, there would be meaning in having gone through that ordeal. And in that state, most likely, we wouldn't be struggling with what we're seeing in today's culture. And I would say probably since, really since the boom of industrial medicine and childbirth. So let's go back to our grandmother's or great grandmother's experience, but probably our grandmother's experience, at least in my generation, right? That was the 50s. And so we could say probably just before that, maybe the 40s. But prior to that, most moms were giving birth either still at home or in a hospital environment with not a lot of intervention, and yes, there were risks that seemed, physical risks that were more prevalent, right? The risk of dying in childbirth seemed more prevalent at that time, at least based on the stories that we were told. So around the 50s, we saw a massive introduction of pharmacology, right? Where not only was there more management in the childbirth process, there was more management with medications, right? And scopolamine was the biggest one that came through, twilight sleep at that time. And so, this was during the time too where babies were often separated from their mom after birth, right? Where breastfeeding wasn't encouraged, it was frowned upon, or it was dirty, right? The more advanced, the more civilized way of being was, to create a lot of separation and, to have a quote, kind of managed, organized, clean birth experience and just to get back on with it. And we started to see, a demise at that time. So that separation, that introduction of that industrial medical management of labor and delivery, like there's a correlation there. And that correlation needs to be looked at, because that interruption in that initiation and the removal of the ceremonial, rite of passage process, or just the lack of acknowledgement altogether, definitely has had an impact on our psyches.
Mhm.
And I feel like it has just intensified or magnified, throughout the times. And, yes, it is spoken that we're kind of in this crisis point right now. And I question whether or not that has to do with the fact that we just have more social media. There's more people talking about it, right? Like it's just trending in that way. So it seems more extreme, but it's just always been there. We just haven't brought it to the forefront like we're doing now because we didn't have the means to do that.
Right, or the words, or the, people to listen, or yes, the justification, which will lead us into the idea of it's me, which I do want to talk to you about.
Right, right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know much about my grandmother's births, but one thing she did tell me is that this was in the 40s when she was having her children, that you went to the hospital, but you were there for a solid week and a half. And I remember her kind of laughing, like, after the seventh day, they'd let you dangle a toe off the side of the bed, but it was just
Mm,
slower. The
mm,
expectation that you were ready to get out of bed was much different even
mm,
than it is today.
mhm,
And I think there is so much value. It's like one of the steps of healing, I think, is looking back at our
mhm,
ancestors' experiences. And for myself, like I feel this enlivening when I reconnect to way generations past, when there was a community of
mm,
care, when there
mm,
was an expectation that you were going to be
mm,
fed, you were going to be
mhm,
able to rest because there were people there that had a clear idea of what care needed to be given during those weeks and during your birth.
mhm,
So I think for me, there has been healing
mm,
with just sitting down and thinking about it, examining it more closely, finding my own connection to generations past that had that. And yet, that's not quite enough. Like there has to be some kind of shift in present practice in order for people to not continue to be the sufferers of a lacking culture around care during this time. So I'm curious about how we can combine looking at the past and kind of reconciling these generations of lack with changing something. I think
mhm.
maybe it's my inner doer that like doesn't want to sit still and not do anything about it. Um, yeah,
Yeah, and I think,
for you.
I think that motivation that you're speaking about in terms of like noticing that there is a gap and then wanting to tend to that, right? And really under it is reduce the suffering or fix the problem. And, I would say that the problem is somewhat obvious now in that um, it's not like we need to do a lot of research to figure out what the problem is, right? The problem is quite massive, actually. It's an extension of this dominant culture that's entire purpose is to separate from our instincts from each other, right? And that the purpose is to value consumption and value, right, capitalism and value motivation towards like power over those kinds of growth at all cost. Like the value system of our Western dominant culture does not align with the value of attachment, connection, and community. And so that is, the more we understand that, the deeper we will understand the magnitude of what it is that we're experiencing and feeling in the postpartum, because many of us can't put words to it. We just have a sense that something is terribly off. And, so this can be what happens with initiations is we often start to wake up to something. And we wake up to maybe a truth in reality that we haven't looked at before, where before we were able to maybe sleepwalk through and just receive, the comforts of, let's say, this culture, without having to do a lot of investigation. But when we are now met with a profound struggle, and when we have gone through an experience that has rattled us and really shifted something within us, and I'm not saying everybody has that experience, so that's like another conversation. But if on that other side, you are trying to pull back all of your pieces, you're trying to kind of remember yourself, right? And sort of orient yourself around like, who am I now? What does it mean to be a mother? And where is my community of support? And where is the culture that takes care of me? Right? Many people don't ask that last question because we are born into this culture for many of us. Therefore, we don't see outside of those waters that we swim in. It wouldn't occur to us that maybe we need to be looking outside of ourselves to see what are the conditions that have set us up for this struggle, for this demise. So to answer your question, of course, there are things that we can do. And I feel like a lot of moms are leaning towards that, right? They set things up ahead of time to get the postpartum care that maybe they need. They hire a postpartum doula. They get a food train system set up, right? They have maybe a blessing way or a mama blessing. They, are trying to bring in these things that they know intuitively and maybe even through research are supportive to their system and will help them integrate that birth experience and mitigate the risk of any kind of postpartum mood disorder, right? So there's this motivation to reduce those risks as much as possible. Like that's understandable, but there's a little bit of a fear of it, right? Like a lot of the moms that I've spoken with over the years are afraid of what's on that other side, right? So there's trepidation leading up to labor and delivery, and then trepidation of how's that postpartum going to go, because I don't want to catch that postpartum problem that so many moms are talking about. So if we don't look at the problem outside of the context of just the individual, we're never going to be able to address it holistically and with enough compassion, right? To recognize that this is not an individual issue. This is a collective issue. And it is helpful to bring all those things in, to bring as much support, like postpartum care and support and community that we can. That is definitely helpful. And it doesn't solve the larger problem. And so my suggestion is always, yes, we want those external supports, and we also want to know how to turn towards the discomfort. And there's so much opportunity if we turn towards the discomfort, especially in that postpartum where we feel the feelings, where we digest and metabolize the grief or the anger, and where we're witnessed in that process, because that really is how we start to reclaim ourselves and our power. But if we're afraid of that, if we're afraid to turn towards those feelings because of, beliefs around what that means, and, I could get into that. If we're afraid of that, then we actually suffer more. And we're suffering more because we're trying to buffer ourselves from feeling those uncomfortable feelings. We're trying to buffer ourselves from even having greater insight and understanding, which might be too much for the system, right? We don't want anything to crack open. And that's just because we have not been held in a, culture of support, in a community container well enough to know that that is actually deeply healing and powerful and necessary, and will help you step into your role as a mother to claim your power in that role. Are you following?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's so much value in recognizing that we can do the physical, practical things, but it can't end there. And that's the key about the initiatory experience, is that has to happen on a subtle level. And I think that as a culture with mental health, spiritual health, the need for it is so great because the ways that we collectively have started to, or just have continued and evolved, has been about creating comfort. It's been creating, practicality, and it hasn't been about examining the deeper reason for why we're doing that, why we're here. And so that brings us into the spiritual aspect of health and healing and being connected on a mental, spiritual, physical level. And postpartum is one of those beautiful kaya kalpa moments in Ayurveda. That's the magical window where we get the invitation to do that. And it's hard, but there's something about, like you said, leaning into the discomfort, like taking a good look at the hard parts, at the confusing feelings, at the indecisiveness, at the anxiety we might feel, at the fearfulness. Those are okay. And potentially when we look closely at them, the power that they have over of us is diffused a little bit, because when you look at something closely, it takes some of the energy of the unknown away from it. So then we discover something new about ourselves, which is all about initiation. It's moving into a new understanding, coming to a new level of evolution within ourselves. So yeah, it's
Well, something that's coming through as you're talking is like an example. For example, as I was saying, our Western dominant culture is a culture of separation. And so what that means is we have been collectively attuned to get our attachment needs met through stuff. It's the easiest way to say it. We have been attuned to get our attachment needs met through accumulation of stuff and the accumulation of money, because we do live in an economic system that is, production and growth at all cost. And that means we have been disoriented, right? There has been a disruption to that very innate attachment circuitry as a biological being. And maybe this is where we can go towards that nervous system stuff, in which we are designed, one of our primary drives is a drive of connection and attachment. So we have two primal drives, and this comes out of polyvagal theory. And it is said that our primary drive for survival is the most basic drive, and it trumps the primary drive for connection. But those two drives are biological drives, meaning if those needs aren't met, the system can die. So if obviously our need for survival, physical survivals are not met, we can die. And if the need for connection, the biological need for social engagement is not met, the system can die. So these are two primary drives that are innate to our nervous system that motivate the human being and mammals, right? The human being towards meeting those needs below conscious awareness. So that drive for connection has been interrupted through a cultural imprint that has oriented us to receive that need, that basic foundational biological need, right, through attachment to the pursuit of money and the pursuit of things and the pursuit out there. So that pursuit trumps our need for biological connection with one another, the whole social engagement system. And when that system is interrupted, we experience alarm, also known as anxiety, right? And we experience depression as a result of not having that need met and our nervous system trying to take care and protect us. Does that make sense? And so what happens is when we have children, that innate system is orienting us towards that need for attachment with our offspring. And that can be interrupted in the birthing process. And that's another conversation, right? But that drive gets like activated tenfold, right? Where it's all of a sudden it takes over and the system orients towards ensuring that that attachment circuitry is being met for our offspring. Because without us as their primary attachment person, right, we cannot survive, especially in infancy. But there's actually quite a large window where we are so dependent for our survival needs and our attachment needs as a species. Other mammals, that dependency is not as long, but for a human, it's quite a long time. And so then we're struggling with that knowing, because we're being pulled in two very different directions. One direction orients towards our intuitive, innate, instinctive knowing, and the other is pulling us towards what we've been programmed by culture to believe. And so a lot of our struggle in the postpartum is we're wrestling with that.
It's so interesting to me how the subliminal messages or the underlying patterns that we are being imprinted with automatically by being in the culture that we are, the ways that that manifests, the ways that we see people in need of all kinds of supports that were just built into society generations ago. But talk a little bit about how this translates into the experience of people feeling like it must be me. Like if we
Sure.
know this, we know that culture's not set up to take care of us in the postpartum window. We know that, and many people giving birth know that, whether or not they've thought deeply about it or spelled it out. I think everyone knows somebody that has not had the support that they need during that transition in life. And yet, even if we know that, if we're in that vulnerable space, why are we so quick to assign an isolating viewpoint of, oh, this is happening to me, therefore I must be doing something wrong, or I must be not meeting my own expectations in some way. There's that initial automatic response that separates us from everybody else's general experience, which must be better than ours. What is that?
Yeah. I'll do my best to like Cole's Notes version that. So first of all, I'll often explain to the people that I work with, and not all mothers. Like I also work with other people on a healing journey who want to go really deep into this work. But I'll explain that what happens is, for the first 7 years of our life, we're very much in the experiential of what's happening in our primary family in particular, and our culture and our environment, right? Like, so we are being influenced by all of that, and a lot of information is being downloaded into our system. And we're not at the developmental stage yet where we're trying to make sense out of it, because our brain hasn't developed into that state yet. into that stage of development where they can question, what is happening and why is it happening? And there's still no kind of prefrontal self-reflective capacity that's going on typically, before age 7. There's a lot happening that gets brought into our biology, right? And the body keeps the score kind of idea, right? So that the felt experience of those times is there. It's embedded and encoded in our cells. But at around that age, and this is to answer your question, at around that age, because of the brain development and the capacity to start to hold the kind of question or self-reflectiveness of, why is this happening? And then very basically, right, the individual is self-oriented at that time. It's a very much an I, me orientation of development. It's developmentally, it's too challenging and almost impossible to be able to hold complex dynamics and make sense out of them, right? The 7-year-old is not thinking, well, this has nothing to do with me. This has everything to do with the fact that my mom and, or my family is, comes from history of trauma, and they don't know how to manage their emotions, and they're stressed, and, their stress is being projected onto me. And so really it has nothing to do with me. I'm not really a burden, obviously a 7-year-old can't do that. Right. So there's no capacity to protect oneself from what is happening. And because the brain is trying to make sense out of highly stressful experiences, right, then it's going to make sense through the lens of, well, this must be about me and it means this. Very basic, right? This is where the core limiting beliefs get imprinted. It must mean that I am bad, I am wrong, right? I'm incapable, I'm not good enough, right? I'm not lovable. I'm all alone, right? You can see how these very simple statements of I am start to get encoded into the system. We'll blow this up into now adulthood and highly stressful experiences. And the brain is still orienting towards making sense out of the stressors, right? In attempt to try to protect that whole system from future harm. So the brain's trying to make sense out of it and then remember it so that it can protect the system in the future. That's kind of its whole role. And one of the ways in which we do that in the sense making process is to then tell ourselves something about ourselves. We're going to make sense out of the stressful situation through the lens of, well, it must have been something about me. And that kind of hooks back into that sort of 7-year-old state where, the way in which the mind was making sense out of things was in this very basic developmental stage and can't hold the complexity of it. So we tend to go there very quickly with all stressful and traumatic events, that underneath all of it is a story about the self. And I'm not minimizing that. Like, it feels very real. It's very painful. We don't want to look at that. We don't want it to be true, right? So it's a substantial moment in one's healing journey when they can kind of stare that, head on, and be with all of the memories associated with it and be with the felt experience of it. But so because of that, what tends to happen is that we default to that. So very few people, let's talk about postpartum. So very few moms in the postpartum are going to be sitting there in their struggle going, well, this has nothing to do with me, right? This is a result of a culture that has failed me and all other mothers and our families. And here's the impact of it. I'm now feeling the pain in response to that kind of initial separation and discord, right? Like, this is painful because you start to see all the areas where we have been let down by modern civilization. So it's much easier to put the lens on ourselves. And because if I can change, or if it's about me, then I'm not going to look out there. And I'm not saying that this is about blame either. I'm not saying let's point our finger on how the caregiver let us down, how the parent, like it's important to notice the impact of all of these players in your life experiences. But I'm not saying that the answer is to just point outside and project everything onto others and even project it onto culture. I'm just saying that to recognize that you're a byproduct of that helps to kind of widen the capacity so that we can do that deeper work. Most often moms relax into that. It's sobering, right? It was like, what? It's not all me, and it's like, well, no, actually, you're part of a system. And this is often the response of that. Right. And now, yes, you have to do the work. That's the kind of unfortunate side of it is you're now tasked with this individual healing work that also has the opportunity to be incredible. Right. Like, so it has that opportunity to crack you open for you to step into more truth and to know deeply who you are outside of those programs and outside of those wounds.
Yeah, that's the initiation. It's
Right.
going to be something that we have to look closely at. It's that, to me, it's like interrupting the loop of it's me, like recognizing that that is happening. That's something that we're falling into because we're at a place where we're not feeling resilient. We're not, we're feeling vulnerable. And so the ability to, even in that place of not being as resilient as we wish to be, we can still recognize that I'm putting this on myself and interrupt that,
Mhm.
and then begin the initiation by looking at the harder things. And I
Mhm.
think that there's something that's so powerful. Earlier, you were talking about, the basic need for attachment, the basic need for community.
Mhm.
And as a culture, we fill those with things that are not actually filling
Right.
those.
Right.
This is another one of those moments where, when we realize that we're not alone in our experience. For a super small example, I remember with my first child having a lot of anxiety about the sleep that I wasn't getting, and
Mhm.
like being really fixated on the hours, and it was very
Mhm.
stressful because I
Mhm.
was putting all my attention there. And then
Mhm.
as I went through my second and third and then fourth postpartum windows, I really started to surrender into
Mhm.
those waking hours.
Mhm.
And I would visualize all of the other parents who were up in the middle of the night around the world with me. And even
Mhm.
if they weren't right there with me, I could feel that I wasn't alone. I could
Mhm.
feel that there was a community of people who were sharing an experience with me in their own way. And it diffused a lot of that stress for me.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think we see this also in ways that, you know, new mom circles. I facilitated one of those for a long time, and like ways that new parents or other people going through their own initiatory experiences can connect with other people. And there's nothing quite like
Mhm.
connecting with someone who gets it, who
Mhm.
has been there, that creates an element of that need for community. Like something there is then fulfilled.
Mhm.
And, you know, setting up, knowing all of the foods to have in your pantry, knowing all the
Mhm.
herbs, having, all right, you can follow everything to the book. But if
Mhm.
you haven't looked at that more subtle spiritual aspect of, this is hard and
Mhm.
I can do this, or this is going to require me to look at some things that feel scary, or I need to have my needs of community, my needs of attachment met in the right ways.
Mm.
Yeah, I've talked to one person in particular sticking out to me, and she learned all of the protocol for Ayurvedic postpartum because she had it all in line. She did it all.
Mhm.
But she was like, none of this helped. And I could
Mhm.
see because she was attaching her healing on tasks and
Mm.
on productivity and on the right supplies and on, things,
Mhm.
and not on what was underneath all of that.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, it is a bit of a paradox, like we're not going to collectively, radically turn this culture around overnight, especially, right? So we are existing within it. And, what I'm hearing you say is there are these ways in which we can tend to this need, knowing that there is this need. So we're going to take care of it to the best of our ability within the cultural context that we're in. And sometimes that, taking care of it in those ways really nourishes and supports the system to move through that process and come out of it feeling enlivened, right, by it. And sometimes we can bring all of that support in and it still not be enough, right? That's what I'm hearing you say. And what's coming up for me around that is how important it is that we look at factors that might be contributing to what is showing up in the postpartum. And I can't remember if we got into this or not in our last conversation, but what really occurred to me as I have been doing this work is that everything gets magnified in the postpartum, in the return, and there and the birth experience being kind of the medicine journey. So if anybody out there, is working with plant medicines or altered states of consciousness, right? Like the birth is the medicine journey. And so the return is the integration. And the return is the kind of embodiment from having been like disembodied. And I always say like kind of like discombobulated, like your cells just sort of um, dissolve, or they like create a lot of spaciousness. We can talk about that. But, so in this return is when aspects of that medicine journey, of that birth journey, can start to show up, and we start to see and understand and experience things that were happening there, right? That's interconnected to our entire life, our entire lived experience. And that needs to be integrated in. And so, all of that to say what's coming up for me is that the postpartum is not a siloed experience, right? Just like in industrialized childbirth, we're taught that there are like phases, right? And stages, and we're measuring those. And so it's very linear, right? And birth is not linear, right? There are no phases and stages in the ways in which, modern obstetrics has been taught, right? It's a spiraling, it's an opening, it's an undoing, it's a journey, right? And so the same thing where like the postpartum is not separate from that initiatory event. It's an extension of, you're still in it. So it's not like a mark of like that ended, this begins now. It's an extension of, it's a continuation of. Therefore, it's really important to also take a look at your birth experience, to also take a look at your prenatal experience, and to take a look at your lived experience and how this might be causing your system to remember historical events as well. And so a lot can show up in the postpartum, and that needs to be assessed, not looking at it through the lens of so we can diagnose and put you in a disordered category. Assess so that we can really do the healing work that could be instrumental to this, you stepping into this new version of yourself, right? There's this opportunity for you to really step in and claim and become and embody and embrace whatever it means to be the mother. And, and so that means there's like a timeline. That means it's kind of like all's on the table, right? And it's not just siloed. In other words, it's not just the lack of sleep. It's not just the lack of physical support, right? It's not just the lack of nourishment or not enough water, right? Or your hormones being out of balance. It's not just that. It's this whole fabric that is, creates your life and you as your unique being, within this cultural milieu.
That's so awesome. I absolutely love the idea, and I've never actually thought of it this way before, of birth as the medicine journey and postpartum as the return and the
Mm,
integration of that journey. And I think there's so much grace to be found in
mm,
looking at it that way and feeling it that way, and the uniqueness and the complexity in which each of us experiences based on what happened to us before we got pregnant, what
mhm,
happened to us during our pregnancy, how all of those things
mhm,
are integrating in this super magnified moment, this window of time.
mhm,
And there's an opportunity to really trust ourselves. And I think that, like, when I look at the whole, it can be overwhelming sometimes
mhm,
because I'm looking at this giant problem and I think,
mhm.
I want to make sense of how to fix it.
Right.
But when we look at it as like a deeply, deeply integrative experience, that so points to the individual, and it's our
Right.
own privilege to go through this initiatory journey for ourselves. And it's almost like prioritizing everyone's unique
Mhm,
journey, like
mhm,
as a society, looking at that, then we kind of collectively begin to heal because we're each given the opportunity to look at it from our own beautiful, unique story.
yeah.
So it brings it down to this, oh, like, I'm going to care for my heart and my story and my journey right now. And that then is going to enable me to parent my child in a way that creates
Mhm,
an imprint for them that maybe is different than the unhealthy imprints that we're all navigating due to
mhm,
society that we want to change in many ways.
mhm,
But yeah, I'm curious for you in your own journey of integrating your story, your medicine journey,
mhm,
like how, what are, what's a way that like you felt that integration happen for you? What was something
mhm,
that helped you to experience this exiting of it's
mhm,
me and embrasure of
mm.
this is an integration and I've got this.
Well, I think first of all, noting that integration and embodiment is a forever journey. So I've been on that path. My son just turned 24, and I'm still in integration of all the wisdom that came through those experiences. So, three very unique birthing experiences, three very different postpartum experiences. And I'm always, I'm still gathering wisdom from it and still healing aspects of it every time I have a conversation with somebody else, every time I hear another mother's story, and I can feel into how that is lifting up something within myself that I didn't observe or look at or had the opportunity to back then. But something that, I guess you could say I was very gifted with right after the birth of my first, to my surprise, was that I instinctively followed my instincts. And so, right from the very beginning, for whatever reason, I navigated all of that. I was 23 years old. So that's very young in today's standards. And I had an unplanned, unexpected pregnancy. So this was not something that I had been prepared for. In fact, I thought I would never have children. So this, is like a total shift in my thought of the path that I was going to be taking. But throughout all of it, from the moment that I discovered that I was pregnant, to how I gave birth, to how I managed the postpartum, into how I parented, all of that was guided by this instinctive knowledge that comes through my nervous system. I didn't have that language back then. So, for example, I fired my obstetrician at 7 months pregnant and hired a group of midwives. Had no money to pay for that service, sold my motorcycle, my precious motorcycle at the time. And my partner at the time won some money at a hockey game, and that paid for our midwives. So otherwise we had no resources to afford, the private care of midwifery at that time. But that didn't matter. I just knew in my body and in my instinct that the service I was getting over here with the obstetricians was not nourishing me, and that it wasn't actually aligning to kind of like the kind of experience I wanted to have and who I knew myself to be, that they were imposing a lot of fear on on me. And I could see through that. Why, I don't know. So I made this transition, that's a pretty radical decision to make, and followed through on that, followed through on, having a home birth, followed through on having a water birth. These were all decisions I was making that were instinctive. It's not like I was plugged in to a lot of, community conversation around birthing that way. My family was definitely not orienting towards that. And the point of all of that was, when my son was born, I remember still to this day, this visceral knowing that overwhelmed my body, to my surprise, that I could be that attached and bonded to another human being, my offspring, through a biological orientation, because my psychology hadn't caught up to that yet, if that makes any sense. My psychology was, I'm not taking care of my kids. I even told my partner at the time, I'm a feminist. You can go stay home. And, at least that's what I was thinking at the time. And, I'm doing my master's in sports psychology. So I'm going to be the one who's going to go to work. And it doesn't have to be the old school ways, like there was we joked about that. And then as soon as my son was born, I remember within that first week of that postpartum period, being so delighted in what was happening for me in terms of this attachment. And I just verbalized and said, well, that's not happening. Whatever it was that I thought was going to happen, I'm like, no, my whole body system is saying no. And it's orienting towards my son. And so I made every decision there on forth, really tuning into that instinctive knowing and following what my nervous system was, inspiring me to do, which went against the cultural norms, which went against even my psychology, went against even my personality. I was like, I don't know if I even know who this is, this mother figure that's going through the motions and doing all these things. So it's taken time for me to embody myself in that and claim it, but I didn't interrupt it. I followed it. And I feel, very blessed that I followed it, because there have been wonderful outcomes as a result of that. Does that answer your questions, sort of?
I love that answer to my question, and it brings me to something that had come up for me earlier in this conversation that I was listening to and hadn't said yet, is that we can trust our being with how to do all of this. We don't have to learn the tools and learn the skills. It's there.
Exactly.
So to me, that is like kind of the pinnacle piece. Like if you release all of the external things that stick to us,
Yeah.
the way forward is inside.
Yeah.
So whether that is an unconscious experience, as many of us have early on, or later on when we've learned a lot of things and we kind of have a heads up going in and it's more of a conscious experience, the certainty that we can foster, that we know what to do, that our way will be paved by ourselves because it's there already, is so important, because that creates empowerment and embodiment
Mhm.
versus separation.
Absolutely. I mean, our body. So when you say we, I'm going to distinguish the difference between the psychology, the mind knowing what to do, or your cognitions knowing what to do, and your body knowing what to do. So your body system, your nervous system, absolutely knows how to do this. And the key here is that we have been separated from our embodied system, right? So part of the separation is separating us from this body system and even hating it, right? And doubting it, right? Not listening to what we're actually experiencing, what we're actually feeling, and not receiving the reinforcements too of like, yes, what you were thinking, feeling, what you were feeling, your intuition, your gut knowing, yes, that was accurate, right? Instead, it's often been met with, doubting it and told it's wrong and told to ignore it and told to like, swallow that down. And so the return to our embodied system and choosing to listen to that versus the cultural psychology, the imprinting, the what I should do's, the what I shouldn't do's, the what everybody's telling me to do, right? If we just listen to what our embodied system knows how to do because it is deeply embedded in the wisdom of the body, right? We will find our way. Absolutely. The struggle we face is actually what I call the inner war, the tension between listening to our embodied knowing and then struggling with what, the cultural psychology, right? The what we should be doing or shouldn't be doing. Well, my body wants to do this, but I'm told I should do this. That's the tug of war. That's what creates the suffering in the postpartum. And you said it best when you said, I finally surrendered to the sleep. And, meaning I just let myself be in that spaciousness of this time, right? I've often told people, look, like when you enter that postpartum period, there is no 24-hour clock, right? It's a timeless period. If we're on the 24-hour clock, we are going to struggle because there's an expectation that I need to get this amount of sleep. And it's the struggle, it's the psychology behind that, the worry, the story we're telling ourselves about it, the anticipation of what tomorrow will mean if I don't get that sleep, that actually makes it more challenging for us versus that moment of surrender, that moment of being with this expanded state of consciousness of absolute sleep deprivation, which, by the way, is also putting you in an altered state of consciousness, right? Which there's so much opportunity when we're there. Some people don't like that word, altered state of consciousness, but it's a non-ordinary state of consciousness, right? And so if we can just rest in that, being like, this is part of it, right? There is no clock, there's no schedule. I'm going to be in bed for 12 hours today, for example, or maybe I'm not coming out. And it's like this coming to and drifting off, coming to and drifting off, right? That there's permission for that. And you figured that out, and that reduced the struggle and probably supported you to get some rest. And rest doesn't mean 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. It's the rest that we're looking for, right?
Yeah, it's the permission of being able to look at something in a different way. It's
Yeah.
releasing
Yeah,
somebody else's story from my experience.
exactly. So that big question of, is this mine? Right? Is this story mine? Is this the cultural story? Is this my family's story? Right? Where did this story come from? And story meaning cognitions, right? Story meaning that the narrative that we tell ourselves about what we're experiencing. So becoming aware of that is really important. And the way in which we become aware of that is we start to pay attention to what we're hearing ourselves say about a situation. And so one of the questions I'll often ask of my clients, but encourage them to start asking it for themselves, is not, what am I thinking? It is, what am I hearing myself say about this? And like, what am I hearing myself say, right? Not what am I thinking, not what are you saying? What am I hearing myself say? And that turns your attention inwards to pay attention to all of that inner narrative. And if we can get that inner narrative to the forefront, so it's not just like running a program in the background, and that program, like a computer program, we're not conscious of it, but that program's running and there's a lot of information being downloaded into your system. And that information, when not conscious, runs the show, right? It is actually why it results in what you feel, think, and behave until you become conscious of it. So what am I hearing myself say about this situation? And then brain dump it, write it all down, and just keep doing that. Every time you're struggling, every time you're activated, every time you're frustrated, every time you feel a charge in your body, every time you experience something that you would label as anxiety or depression, ask the question. And this is not about bypassing with toxic positivity. This is not about replacing it. And it's not about not turning towards it. You have to turn towards it to go through it. You have to be able to turn towards it to question those stressful thoughts to see if they're true. And that's when you start to realize, wait a minute, like, where's the program coming from? And that's when you realize that's not me. That's not mine. And I can change it.
There's such a sense of release when we can pull out that idea that we, without thinking, fall back into, and that ability to stop and ask yourself that question. What am I saying about this? Or like, what am I hearing? I think those were your words. What am I
hearing myself say?
say about this or that?
Yeah.
And when we can pull that out and recognize that's not actually what is true for me, that's not actually real, there's a palpable release that happens because we've identified that that's something that's created and not something that's actual.
Yeah.
And
So
I love,
mhm.
what you said earlier too about your own experience and prefacing it with this is something that I do every day. I'm still doing it. And I think that's really true for all of us. It's not like this place that we arrive at and all of a sudden we're fixed. This is like we're ongoing in life,
Mhm.
ongoing in our own evolution individually and together. And so recognizing it as this is an ongoing exploration for me and an uncovering and a remembering, and that's okay and that's perfect and that's exactly what it's supposed to be, can create comfort in continuing to struggle with things now and
Mm.
then, and create resiliency as we get more and more practice recognizing what is
Mhm.
a cultural imprint or a self-created idea versus,
Mhm.
you know, not actually my real heart and soul.
And, so one of the ways in which we can measure that I'll remind my clients about and myself is that truth is expansive. It creates opening, it creates relaxation. There's a sense of comfort that you'll experience in your embodied state. So truth is expansive, whereas what I call the lies of the stories that we tell ourselves, they're constrictive. And so not labeling it necessarily with emotional language, but more an embodied felt sense of and it's a very simple question, does my body open to this or does my body constrict to this? And paying attention to that subtlety. Um, so paying attention, in terms of actions, right? So we can have this large philosophical understanding about, maybe why we're in the problem that we're in. And the problem is bigger than just us. And the problem's been happening for a very long time, right? So this is a substantial problem. And therefore, you could say we're also a byproduct of that problem. And one of the things that we're experiencing is this real suffering in the postpartum. So we can chat philosophically about that. And then, the question is, so now that we know that, how do I begin my healing journey? Right? And because you're not going to solve the culture problem, right? One person is not going to be able to come in and say, this isn't working. We need to change this. And that's just most likely not going to happen. And so, maybe collectively it will. And so my belief is that if we all take these opportunities individually to do this deep work, who knows collectively what will unravel, right? We might not even know what the potential is, but I believe that the potential would be that if we're clearing our system from the burdens and the debris and the traumas, and we're creating a coherent system and one that really is vibrating in the frequency of love, which can be measured, you know basically miracles are possible, right? And so the more of us that see the value of doing the work to step towards that state of being, which is actually our innate state of being, right? That coherent state of being with that frequency of love, with hearts opened, with soft, soft strength, not guarded, armored strength, soft strength in which we can turn towards that which we're feeling and not fear the impact of that, right? And we're held in that and we're seen in that. I mean, something magical can happen. And I really do believe that, that the birthing process is the one initiatory journey that still exists within this culture because we're still having babies. Right? There may not be, like, we don't put a lot of attention on rites of passage and ceremonies and, initiatory events for our own growth and development. But this one thing is still happening, and we can claim it. Collectively, we can reclaim that and say, no, you're not taking this away. And that's why I think that actually mothers and those that go through this initiation have a lot of power to, influence the state in which we are all collectively existing within right now. And, that's a heavy load because we're just trying to survive in that postpartum, right? But I believe that is possible and that there's an opportunity here. And I'm not saying it's easy, but initiation's not easy.
It's not. And similarly to each of us learning to listen to our own, is this expansive right now, or is this closing? Like that discernment, that ability to do that is something that we can do automatically. We don't necessarily have to be conscious of it, though it's helpful to be conscious of it. I feel that way about culture at large. Like we don't have to like orchestrate the fixing of it.
No.
It's happening because so many people are starting to look closer at these questions and their own experience, unconsciously and consciously. And I trust that with all of those people beginning those questions and deeper looks at themselves and the issue at large, it naturally is creating a shift, which we're seeing more and more of, even in, the 17 years since I became a parent. There's so much more. So, I mean, all of this to me is just so important and beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing your work and your perspectives, which I just am so inspired by. Do you feel like there's anything that you would like to leave our listeners with? I feel like we've already covered some really beautiful ways to begin opening ourselves and trusting ourselves and healing ourselves. But is there anything else you want to leave people with?
So like on a practical side of things, just kind of like on a note of up and out and inspiration, every small step towards, your embodied state, it's meaningful and it will kind of bring you towards, the state of being that is one of health and vitality. So just each baby step matters. And that although it might feel daunting, if you think about where you want to be and where you are, just knowing that you're not in it alone, knowing that there are paths carved out, knowing that there are those that have gone before you, knowing that, just one day at a time, one tear at a time, that it will make a difference. And so that it doesn't have to be so overwhelming. And also just understanding and appreciating that although you might hear all of these things and you yourself might be in that postpartum struggle, right, that it can feel very frustrating and very daunting and kind of like, well, it can, that's great, that sounds really lovely, but I'm like barely getting in the shower and feeding myself and getting out of bed and like, nothing's going to help me in this state, or, you're not really talking about what I'm experiencing right now. And just want to say to those moms that are really struggling right now, to do one thing, to reach out somewhere. Like it doesn't have to be with my services, but to reach out and connect to an organization or a person, or, go into the forest or do one thing for yourself, today that is different than what you have been doing. And if that one thing is just taking a moment to pay attention to, what am I hearing myself say about this situation, to bring it to the forefront so it could be worked with, that one thing could be, the turn. It could be what is it, the thing that moves the needle. So I think that's really important, to recognize that, yes, I think we both know that it can be very hard, very dark, very lonely, very scary. And, all that feels very real in this moment for some people. And so take one step, even just voicing, I feel alone in my darkness right now, and letting somebody else in is really important. And then in terms of like other ways to connect, I am putting together a program, like a mentorship program, the Art of Mastering Perinatal Therapy. And so that would be for therapists or those who work with moms in the postpartum. So if there's anybody out there who works in this field and they liked the paradigm that I was talking about, this program goes deep into nervous system informed care. It also unfolds the therapeutic map. So there's a whole program for that, the therapy map, I mean, and also the flowing fears process. So that question of what am I hearing myself say about this situation, that's like question 4 of the 10-step process, which is intended to help you go down and under, but then come up and out. And that up and out is critical. So I think that that's kind of where we got here today, you and I, with the up and out. And then I also work with the flowing fears process as a coach for moms, not moms, right? Anybody who's interested in doing that kind of next level therapeutic work where they want to really dive in and come up and out. And we use that 10-step process. And that's on my Flowing Fears website. So
Amazing. I'm so happy that we have connected, and I am so impressed and inspired by the work that you're doing. Jennifer, thank you so much. I really believe in synchronicity and taking advantages of connections that arise, and you've been one of those people in my life. So I'm grateful to you for having these conversations, and I also feel certain that our paths are going to continue to cross with each other.
That would be
So for
lovely.
all of you who are listening, I'm going to make sure that all of this information that Jennifer has shared is listed for you there with links. I'm super excited about your program. I might have to take it myself. So, but thank you. And I hope that this has brought up a lot of great inspired ideas for all of you listening. And we're all in this together as a wider community, searching for greater peace and love for all of our initiatory and transitional experiences as we move through life. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Shanti, Shanti.
The Sacred Window podcast is brought to you by the Center for Sacred Window Studies. You can visit us to find out more about our online training and mentoring programs, plus resources and products for and about the sacred postpartum window at www.sacredwindowstudies.com. And our music is written and performed by Sarah Emmett. You can hear more of Sarah's music by visiting www.sarahemmett.bandcamp.com.